Keanu Reeves was navigating the streets of Los Angeles when something compelled him to hit the brakes. A solitary figure was seated on the sidewalk, enveloped in a worn-out blanket. Initially, it seemed like just another lost soul in the city, but then his heart skipped a beat. He recognized that face. What followed would not only alter his night, but also reveal a painful past he could never overlook. Before we proceed with this tale, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The deep rumble of the Norton Commando 961 pierced the quiet Los Angeles night, resonating through the deserted streets. The city was asleep, its lights flickering softly as the early morning fog began to spread across the asphalt. Keanu Reeves rode his motorcycle with a distant expression, his leather gloves gripping the handlebars tightly, the cold wind brushing against his face. He cherished these hours after long charity events, speeches, and interviews. The bike was his escape. The sound of the engine, the scent of asphalt, the freedom of the road. It allowed him to forget, if only briefly, the burden of fame and expectations. That night's event had been significant. The fundraiser had secured funding for an arts education program in public schools, a cause dear to him. As he shook hands and posed for photos, his mind wandered back to his early days in theater, that insecure kid on stage trying to find his voice. In that stream of thought, something made him blink and ease the brakes. To his right, a figure was curled up on the sidewalk, leaning against the worn-out wall of a closed commercial building. A woman, just another homeless person on the streets of Los Angeles. A common sight that, no matter how painful, had become part of the city's landscape, but then a chill ran down his spine. He couldn't quite identify what made him slow down. Perhaps it was the way she sat, a posture too still, too withdrawn. Maybe it was the way her frail body clung to the dirty, tattered blanket. Perhaps it was just instinct, or maybe it was something else. He frowned, quickly looking forward again, his heart beginning to race, a quiet unease spreading through his chest. The bike moved forward a few more meters before he decided to stop. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. This doesn't make sense, he thought. But what was stopping him from checking, just to be sure, just to clear the doubt in his mind? With a smooth motion, he turned the bike around, slowing down as he approached the spot where he had seen the woman. His headlight cast a dim glow over her frail frame, a small, fragile silhouette against the cold concrete. He pulled over at the curb and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was piercing. Keanu slowly removed his gloves, his fingers trembling for no apparent reason. Something deep inside him already knew the answer before he even asked the question. He stepped forward, his boots echoing on the damp pavement. The woman shifted slightly, perhaps sensing his presence. His heart pounded against his ribs as he got closer, taking in the details, the worn-out coat, the gray, tangled strands of hair escaping from beneath the hood, the thin, wrinkled hands clutching the filthy blanket as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. And then his stomach twisted. Even in the dim light, even with the shadows masking the toll of time and hardship, that face was etched into his memory. Time seemed to freeze. Keanu wetted his lips, his throat tightening. When he spoke, his voice was hesitant, almost a whisper. "Mrs. Collins." The woman shuddered at the sound of his voice. Slowly, as if each movement required tremendous effort, she lifted her face toward him, her dull, weary eyes meeting his. Keanu held his breath for a moment, a heavy silence blanketing the air as if time itself had paused between recognition and disbelief. She blinked slowly, her gaze struggling to focus, her expression flickering from confusion to something else. The world around them disappeared. No more empty streets, no more cold night air. Just this moment suspended between the past and the harsh reality of now. Her lips parted, and then her knees buckled, her body pitching forward. Keanu lunged instinctively, his arms moving fast to catch her before she hit the ground. A chill ran down his spine. She was too light, too fragile. His mind raced with questions, but this wasn't the time for answers, because before he could say anything else, her eyes fluttered closed, and in that instant, Keanu knew nothing about this night would end the way it began. Time seemed to slow as Keanu held Mrs. Collins' frail body before she could hit the ground. His heart pounded against his ribs. "Mrs. Collins," he called again, but there was no response. She was conscious, but seemed unable to hold herself up, her breathing uneven, her thin shoulders trembling. Whether from the cold or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. Keanu glanced around. The streets were empty, only a few distant cars passing by. The faint wail of a siren echoed through the city, blending with the soft hum of the streetlights. He didn't know what to do. Instinctively, he helped her sit up properly, propping her against the wall. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open slowly, unfocused. He noticed the dark circles beneath them, the way her skin was etched with time and suffering. Then she whispered something. "Keanu!" His name came out in a breath of disbelief, as if she were trying to confirm whether he was real or just another figment of a fading memory. Keanu nodded, trying to offer a reassuring smile. His chest felt constricted. "It's me, Mrs. Collins. It's really me." The silence between them was intense. He could see her mind working, trying to understand why he was there. Standing before her after so many years, as the initial shock began to fade, a deeper emotion flickered in her eyes. Recognition. For a brief moment, Keanu was no longer in the chilly streets of Los Angeles. He was a boy again, standing nervously on a small school stage, clutching a script with sweaty hands. Her voice echoed in his mind. "On stage, you never hide. You feel. You live." Then he was back in the present, looking at the woman who had taught him everything about acting. But now she seemed unrecognizable. Keanu's chest tightened. How had this happened? He swallowed hard and finally broke the silence. "Is it really you?" She took a shaky breath, her voice raspy. "I think so." Her words were fragile, as if they carried the weight of years. Keanu hesitated. There were so many things he wanted to ask, but something told him to tread carefully. "You," he started, but stopped. What could he possibly say? Mrs. Collins tried to shift, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She shivered, and Keanu realized just how weak she was. Without thinking, he took off his leather jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at the sudden warmth, but didn't resist. Then, in a barely audible voice, she said, "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" Keanu nodded, watching her closely. Yes, it had been a long time, but no number of years could have prepared him to find her like this. She ran a hand over her face as if trying to wake herself from a nightmare, her gaze dropping to the ground. Keanu noticed her hesitation, the shame of not wanting to be seen like this. But he saw her, and before he could stop himself, the question slipped from his lips. "What happened to you?" The silence that followed was sharp, cutting through the night like a blade. Mrs. Collins lowered her head, her thin hands clutching the filthy blanket tighter against her chest. Keanu could feel the weight of the moment. Her story was there, hidden between the words she couldn't say. He waited, and finally, after a long pause, she whispered something that sent a cold wave through him. "I tried, Keanu." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she looked at him again. "I tried." What did she mean by that? What had she tried? Before Keanu could ask, her body gave out once more. She collapsed forward, and Keanu caught her firmly. This time, he knew he couldn't leave her there. He had to do something. With his mind racing and his heart pounding, Keanu made his decision. But he knew this night was far from over. The silence between them was heavy. Keanu still held Mrs. Collins, making sure she wouldn't collapse again. The weight of her body in his arms felt unreal, like she was only a shadow of the woman he had known years ago. Slowly, he helped her lean back against the cold wall of the building. Her breathing was unsteady, broken by small shivers. He didn't know if it was from the cold night air or sheer exhaustion pulling her down. He hesitated before speaking. "Can you hear me?" She blinked slowly, as if keeping her eyes open was a battle. After a few moments, her gaze found his. "I can." Keanu let out a quiet breath. The truth was, he had no idea what to do. The urgency to help her was overwhelming, but at the same time, he knew he couldn't just pick her up and drag her to a better place. He needed to understand, what happened to you? Mrs. Collins immediately looked away. The question lingered between them, unanswered. The silence stretched. Keanu sat beside her, ignoring the cold, dirty pavement. She didn't have to answer right now, but he wasn't going anywhere. He would wait. Mrs. Collins clutched the blanket tighter around herself, as if it was the only thing holding her together. Her breathing had steadied, but her gaze remained distant. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice low and rough. "You shouldn't be here." Keanu looked at her calmly. "And you should?" She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Nice one, Reeves." He didn't smile. There was something in her eyes, something beyond pain. Shame. She didn't want to be seen like this, but he had already seen her. Mrs. Collins took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to keep going. "The truth is, I don't know what to say. I didn't want anyone to see me like this, least of all you." Keanu remained silent. He knew that sometimes silence was more powerful than any words. She hesitated, her eyes locked on the empty street. Then finally, she began to speak. "I lost my job when the theater program was cut." Keanu had suspected something like that might happen, but hearing it from her made it real. "I tried to keep going, offering private lessons for a while and taking on small jobs here and there, but everything started to unravel. The bills piled up, and the city consumed me entirely." She paused, her gaze drifting into memories that seemed too painful to relive all at once. "Initially, I thought it was just a rough patch, that I'd find something new and everything would return to normal. But as the months went by, I suddenly found myself without a home." Keanu felt a knot tighten in his throat. He had always known life could be harsh, but he never imagined she had fallen this far. "I spent some time moving from couch to couch, staying with people who still cared, but eventually, doors began to close. People get tired. No one wants a long-term problem in their life." Keanu knew that was true. The world could be unforgiving. Mrs. Collins rubbed her hands together as if trying to shake off a cold that had settled deep inside her. And then, before I realized it, it was too late. Keanu's chest ached as he thought of everything she had meant to him. All the times she had encouraged him and helped him find his voice on stage. And now she was here, alone and broken. He wanted to say something, but before he could, she murmured almost to herself, "The hardest part isn't losing things. It's losing people." She pressed her lips together as if holding something bigger inside. Then her voice dropped lower, trembling. "I pushed everyone away, Keanu, the few who still cared, because the truth is, I didn't want to be a burden." A chill ran through him. He knew that feeling, the sense that you're dragging people down, that it's better to disappear than to become someone else's problem. He knew that shadow, but seeing it in her hurt in a way he wasn't prepared for. Then she said something that made his heartbeat quicken. "And I made a mistake I can't undo." She didn't explain, but Keanu noticed the hesitation in her voice, the weight behind her words. There was something else, something she wasn't ready to say. Not yet. The silence stretched between them. Keanu ran a hand through his hair, trying to think. He wanted to ask the right questions, but he knew he couldn't push, so he simply said firmly, "You're not a burden to me." Mrs. Collins closed her eyes, looking away. "You say that now." Keanu shook his head. "I say that because it's true." She let out a long breath, like she wanted to believe him but couldn't. And then he asked the question he didn't want to ask but knew he had to. "What about your children?" The air between them shifted. Mrs. Collins's body tensed. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. But then she whispered, barely audible, "They tried to help me for a while." The incomplete answer made Keanu's stomach turn. What happened with her children? Why was she here alone? Before he could ask anything else, Mrs. Collins's gaze drifted back to the empty street. She seemed distant, far from this moment, and for the first time that night, Keanu saw something in her eyes that unsettled him. A silent darkness, a pain too deep to put into words, something beyond physical suffering. And he knew her story was far worse than he had imagined, and he hadn't heard all of it yet. Her words hung in the air like a knife suspended, ready to fall. "They tried to help me for a while." Keanu felt the weight of that sentence. Mrs. Collins's tone wasn't just sad. There was something else beneath it, something he didn't yet understand. The silence between them stretched. She kept staring at the empty street as if she were somewhere else, lost in memories he couldn't reach. Keanu wanted to ask more, he wanted to understand, but something in her expression stopped him. He noticed the way her fingers clenched around the filthy blanket, holding on to it as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded in the present. So he just waited. The sharp night wind swept through the street, carrying the distant sound of a car passing on another avenue. Finally, she sighed. They did what they could. They helped when things started to fall apart. She moved her fingers slowly, lost in thought, but after a while, I pushed them away. Keanu frowned. Why? She let out a short, hollow laugh. Because I didn't want to be a burden. He closed his eyes for a moment. That feeling, he knew it well, but still, it didn't make sense. And they just accepted that? Mrs. Collins hesitated before answering. Not right away. They tried. They gave me options. But I refused. She bit her lower lip as if holding something bigger inside. After a while, they stopped insisting. Keanu felt a tightness in his chest. He tried to picture what had happened. He imagined her children's faces he had never seen, reaching out to help her, only to watch her pull away. And then all that remained, silence settled over them again. And that's when he noticed something. When the sleeve of her tattered coat slipped slightly, he saw it, a scar, thin and pale, stretching along her forearm. A knot formed in his stomach. She realized he had seen it, but she didn't move to cover it. She just looked at him, and in that look, there was a warning. Don't ask. Keanu pressed his lips together. He wanted to ask. He wanted to know what it meant. But part of him already knew the answer, and for now, he wasn't sure she was ready to talk about it. So instead, he simply said, his voice steady, I'm here now. Mrs. Collins let out a short laugh. Then what difference does that make? Keanu looked directly into her eyes. It signifies that you're no longer alone. She blinked, as if those words were hard to comprehend. Before she could reply, the silence of the night was interrupted by footsteps. Someone was walking along the sidewalk, not far from them. Keanu instinctively turned his head, and Mrs. Collins did the same. A shadow moved under the dim streetlights. A man in loose, dirty clothes, his weary eyes fixed on them. He stopped a few feet away. Hey! His voice was rough. Got a cigarette? Mrs. Collins shook her head. I don't smoke. The man glanced at Keanu, who just stared back, relaxed yet vigilant. The man shrugged and continued walking. Mrs. Collins exhaled slowly. Don't trust anyone around here, she advised, looking at Keanu. You should go. He raised an eyebrow. And leave you here alone? She chuckled softly. I'm not as fragile as I look. Keanu narrowed his eyes. No, but you're not invincible either. She didn't respond. The wind blew again, lifting dust from the sidewalk. Keanu knew this night was far from over, and that Mrs. Collins had much more to share. The night dragged on, and the city of Los Angeles remained cold and indifferent. Keanu had no idea how long he had been sitting there with Mrs. Collins. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. But something inside him told him he couldn't just leave her there. She, on the other hand, seemed convinced otherwise. You should go. Her voice was quiet but firm. Keanu crossed his arms, leaning against the wall beside her. I won't. She let out a tired sigh. Keanu, don't even try to convince me. Her eyes flickered with a mix of exasperation and something else he couldn't quite decipher. Were you always this stubborn? He smirked slightly. I learned from a certain teacher. She lowered her head and let out a short, humorless laugh. The silence between them lingered. Mrs. Collins pulled the blanket tighter around herself, shrinking slightly. Keanu could see how exhausted she was, how the cold in the streets had drained her. But he also saw something deeper. She didn't want help, or rather, she didn't believe she deserved it, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Keanu looked around. The streets were empty, but he knew the city never truly slept. He turned back to her, his voice more serious now. You can't stay here all night. She lifted her eyes to him. And what do you suggest? Keanu hesitated for a moment before answering. Let's go somewhere else. She raised an eyebrow, as if the idea was absurd. And where would we go? He thought quickly. A hotel? No, she would refuse. His house, she would never accept. Then an idea surfaced, a 24-hour cafe. She blinked, caught off guard. What? Keanu shrugged. Nothing fancy, just a warm place. Coffee, food, you can rest for a bit. She opened her mouth to refuse, but Keanu spoke first. Just 1 hour, then you decide what to do. Mrs. Collins pressed her lips together. He could see the battle happening inside her. Accepting meant admitting she needed help, but refusing meant spending the night on that cold piece of concrete. Finally, she sighed. 1 hour. Keanu let out a small smile. Deal. The bell on the cafe door jingled as they stepped inside. The place was simple, with a few scattered customers at worn-out tables. Keanu led Mrs. Collins to a quiet corner. She walked slowly, as if every step took effort. Once they sat down, a waiter approached. What can I get you? Keanu looked at Mrs. Collins, waiting for her to order, but she hesitated. He noticed she wasn't used to choosing, so he did it for her. 2 coffees and whatever's the warmest, most filling thing on the menu. The waiter nodded and walked away. Mrs. Collins looked at him. Have you always had this instinct to save people? Keanu shrugged. I just do what feels right. She sighed, running a hand through her hair, still messy despite being clean. Sometimes people don't want to be saved. Keanu held her gaze for a moment. Sometimes they just think they can't be. Silence settled between them again. When the coffee arrived, Mrs. Collins wrapped both hands around the cup as if absorbing its warmth. She closed her eyes as she took the first sip. Keanu watched her. She looked so small in that moment. So much had been taken from her, but at the same time, he saw something different. A spark, faint but still there. Then suddenly, she broke the silence. You want to ask about the scar, don't you? The question caught Keanu off guard. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about lying, saying no, but he was always a terrible liar. I do. She lowered her eyes to the table. It took a few moments before she spoke. I was at my lowest point. Keanu, worse than now. He held his breath. She traced the rim of her cup with her fingers. I didn't see a way out. I didn't think it was worth trying. A chill ran down Keanu's spine. She didn't need to say more. He understood. Mrs. Collins took a deep breath. But I'm here, still, somehow. Keanu watched her for a long time, then simply said, I'm glad you are. She lifted her eyes to him, surprised, and for a brief moment, Keanu saw something new in her expression. Something that wasn't there before. Hope. Mrs. Collins looked down at her coffee, lost in thought, then she murmured, Why are you doing this, Keanu? He didn't answer right away. He just held her gaze and mentioned that it was because you did it for me. Initially, silence enveloped them, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. A silence brimming with potential. The first step had been taken, yet the journey ahead remained lengthy. Mrs. Collins held the warm coffee in her hands, not drinking it, as if the warmth could somehow tether her to reality. Keanu observed quietly, aware that this night marked a turning point not only for her, but for him as well. She had finally spoken about the pain, the scar, and the burden of the choices that had brought her here. But now came the most challenging part. Accepting genuine help, Mrs. Collins sighed, placing the cup on the table. Keanu straightened his posture. Now, let me help, he said. She let out a soft, weary laugh. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Keanu met her gaze. By taking you somewhere you can start anew. She shook her head. It's not that simple. Why not? She opened her mouth to reply, but hesitated. For the first time, she seemed uncertain about refusing. Keanu noticed and realized he was close to breaking the invisible barriers she had erected around herself. He took a deep breath before continuing. I found you by chance tonight, but now that I have, I won't just walk away. She looked away. I don't want to be your responsibility, Keanu. It's not about responsibility. He leaned forward slightly. It's about choice. She blinked, puzzled. Choice. Yes, you chose to help so many students in the past. You chose to believe in me when I doubted myself. Now it's my turn to believe in you. She swallowed hard. The truth was, no one had spoken to her like this in a long time. And what if I fail? Her voice was barely a whisper. Keanu gave her a small, knowing smile. And what if you don't? Mrs. Collins fell silent. That was it. The question she had never allowed herself to ask. She had spent her life believing she was already lost. But now, for the first time in a long time, someone was asking, "What if you weren't?" Slowly, as if testing the words, she murmured, "What do you have in mind?" Keanu didn't hide his smile. A support center for homeless women. They offer recovery programs, therapy, housing assistance, and job referrals. She frowned slightly. "And you think I belong there?" Keanu raised an eyebrow. "I think you deserve a second chance." Mrs. Collins remained silent for a long moment, the internal struggle visible. But then she slowly nodded. It was barely a movement, but Keanu sighed. "Okay," she said. Those words, so simple, meant far more than they seemed. They were the beginning of something new. Keanu drove through the still sleeping city, this time not on his motorcycle. He had managed to get a car so she could be more comfortable. She sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the streets pass by through the window, lost in thought. By the time they arrived at the center, the sun was beginning to rise. It was a simple, unassuming building, but with a welcoming atmosphere. Women moved about, some carrying bags, others speaking in hushed voices. Keanu turned off the engine and looked at her. "Ready?" She let out a slow breath. "I don't know." "That's okay," he smiled. "We do this at your pace." She looked at the entrance, then back at Keanu, and finally, she opened the car door and stepped out. Mrs. Collins walked slowly toward the entrance, her fingers hovering over the door handle, hesitating. Keanu stood beside her. "One step at a time," he said. She closed her eyes for a moment, and then finally, she stepped inside. Keanu smiled. The transformation had begun. The support center carried the faint scent of coffee and freshly baked bread. The walls were lined with framed messages of encouragement, and the space felt warmer than Mrs. Collins had expected. But the discomfort was still there. She felt every glance that landed on her, every voice murmuring in the background. A part of her wanted to turn around and leave before it was too late. But then she looked to her side. Keanu was there. No rush, no pressure, just waiting. She took a deep breath and took the first step. The community theater was bustling that afternoon. Children ran across the stage, laughing, trying to memorize their lines for the play at the end of the month. Keanu walked among the young actors, helping a boy project his voice, but suddenly he stopped. In the distance, near the side door, he saw her, Mrs. Collins. Not the woman he had found that cold night. Now she was stronger, more alive. Her once unkempt hair was neatly tied in a simple bun, and her clothes were clean and well kept. She looked more herself. Keanu smiled. She caught his gaze and walked over. "I think you tricked me, Reeves," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah, how so?" She crossed her arms, looking at the stage. "You told me it was just a support center. You didn't tell me it was also a place where I'd find myself again." He chuckled. "Some things you only discover along the way." Mrs. Collins sighed, shaking her head. "I never thought I'd work with theater again." Keanu smiled. "But it was always in you." She looked at him for a moment, saying nothing. Then a small smile appeared on her lips. She turned to the children on stage. "All right, everyone. I want to feel some real emotion in those lines." The young actors' voices grew louder, and the stage came to life once more. Keanu crossed his arms and watched. She was back. Maybe not completely. Maybe there would still be hard days. But for the first time in a long time, she was truly there. Life doesn't always give second chances, but sometimes all we need is someone who believes in us. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience. In case you did not watch Keanu Inspirational last story, I will leave you with it now. Wish you enjoy it.
Tom Cruise enters a luxurious restaurant in the heart of the city, dressed in simple, wrinkled clothes as if he had just come from an ordinary day. He chooses a discreet table, trying to go unnoticed while the glow of crystal chandeliers illuminates the space around him. But before he even gets the chance to place his order, a waitress approaches with a look of disdain and an arrogant posture. "Are you sure you can afford to be here?" she snaps, her tone laced with irony, loud enough for other patrons to hear. What happens next not only leaves everyone in the restaurant stunned, but reveals a truth that changes everything. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow, we have another special story for you. The Lumiere restaurant was a symbol of sophistication in Beverly Hills. Located on one of the city's most prestigious avenues, its wide windows offered a view of streets illuminated by luxurious neon signs and slow-moving sports cars. Inside, every detail was carefully curated to impress. Lumiere wasn't just a restaurant. It was a destination for those who wanted to be seen and admired. Ashley, one of Lumiere's most experienced waitresses, moved confidently through the dining room wearing a rehearsed smile. Her immaculate bun and tailored uniform reinforced her image of efficiency and control. Working there wasn't just a job, it was a privilege, at least that's how Ashley saw it. Being a waitress at one of Beverly Hills' most renowned restaurants was something she mentioned with pride whenever she had the chance. But Ashley had another side, an exaggerated pride that often spilled over into arrogance. She had a peculiar talent for quickly judging patrons, mentally categorizing them based on their clothing, demeanor, and appearance. Some people just don't belong here, she often thought. The restaurant's glass doors swung open smoothly, and a man walked in. He wore worn-out jeans, a simple shirt, and a jacket that looked comfortable but lacked any hint of luxury branding. His presence was understated, almost invisible, as he calmly made his way to the reception desk. Tom Cruise wasn't a man who enjoyed flaunting his wealth. Despite being one of Hollywood's most well-known stars, his reserved demeanor stood in stark contrast to the extravagant sparkle of Beverly Hills. At that moment, he seemed like just another ordinary customer. Ashley was busy at the reception desk discussing a VIP reservation with another staff member when she noticed Tom. She abruptly stopped talking, her gaze narrowing as she assessed him with barely concealed disdain. He didn't look anything like the typical Lumiere clientele. Without hiding her reaction, she tilted her head and gave him a slow once-over, her eyes lingering on his scuffed boots. "Good evening," she said in a dry tone, forcing a smile that disappeared almost instantly. "How can I help you?" "I'd like a table, please," Tom said, his tone polite and calm. Ashley raised an eyebrow as if she had just heard something absurd. Her expression seemed to ask, "How dare he?" She crossed her arms, her smile vanishing entirely. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This is a very exclusive restaurant." Tom continued to smile, unfazed. "Yes, this is the place," he replied calmly. Ashley let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking her head. "Okay, just a moment. I need to check something." She turned quickly, not bothering to maintain any semblance of politeness, and headed to the reception office. There, she accessed the reservation system, typing his name with exaggerated flair. When nothing came up, she rolled her eyes and returned to the dining area, visibly annoyed. "Well, as I suspected, you don't have a reservation," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "We do have a few tables available, but just so you know, this isn't a casual dining spot." Tom remained unbothered, his calm demeanor seemingly irritating her even more. "I'd like to dine here," he replied, his tone unchanged. Ashley let out an exaggerated sigh, grabbing a menu with an abrupt motion. "All right, but I'll need to seat you in a suitable area. Follow me." She began walking briskly through the dining room without looking back to see if he was following. When they reached the farthest, least appealing corner of the restaurant, she dropped the menu on the table with an audible thud. "Here you go. This table is perfect for you," she said in a falsely sweet tone. "If you need anything, let me know, but only if it's necessary, okay?" Tom maintained his slight smile, ignoring her tone. "Thank you. I'm sure this will be an interesting experience." As she walked away, Ashley muttered under her breath, loud enough for a nearby couple to hear, "He won't last 5 minutes here. Bet he'll leave as soon as he opens the menu." Across the dining room, Tom calmly opened the menu, his eyes scanning the options without haste. The live music continued to fill the air, but something about his posture was intriguing, as if nothing could disturb his serenity. From the other side of the room, Ashley watched with a smug smile, certain that he would soon ask for the check and disappear. Ashley led Tom through the dining room with quick, mechanical steps, not even bothering to look at him. Instead of choosing a table in the center, where the golden light from the chandeliers highlighted the elegance of the environment, she took him to the most hidden and poorly lit corner of the restaurant. It was a table near the kitchen, where the sound of dishes being washed and the muffled chatter of staff created an atmosphere far removed from the rest of the dining room. "Here you go. This table should do," she said, dropping the menu on the table carelessly. "I think you'll feel comfortable here. It's more private." Tom glanced at the table and then at Ashley, his slight smile unwavering. "Thank you," he replied calmly. She crossed her arms and narrowed her eyes as if trying to figure out whether he was being sarcastic or simply clueless. "You're welcome," she replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just so you know, we usually reserve these tables for special cases, but since we don't have anything booked tonight, you can have it." Spinning on her heels, she left before he could respond. When Ashley returned to the table to take his order, her behavior became even more cruel. She pulled out her notepad with an exaggerated motion and cast a cold glance at Tom. "Have you decided what you'd like?" she asked, not bothering to hide the boredom in her voice. "Or would you like a recommendation?" Tom looked at the menu and calmly pointed to one of the most expensive main courses. "I'd like to try this one." Ashley stifled a laugh, covering her mouth with one hand as if trying to hold back a snide comment. "Oh, of course, the filet de rossini," she said with a condescending tone. "A classic dish. Just to confirm, sir, you do know this costs $350, right?" Tom nodded, his calm demeanor unchanging. "Yes, it sounds wonderful." She tilted her head, her lips curling into a malicious smile. "All right, then. Just to make sure there aren't any misunderstandings later, I suggest you double-check the prices. We wouldn't want anyone to have unpleasant surprises." Tom remained unfazed, which seemed to irritate her even more. "I'm certain," he said calmly. Ashley let out a dramatic sigh, as if she were doing him a huge favor, and jotted down the order. "Very well. As you wish. But I'll warn you, our chef prefers dishes like this to be enjoyed by those who truly appreciate fine dining. I hope it meets your expectations." She spins on her heels again, but before leaving, she stops and turns back. "Oh, and one more thing, the minimum tip expected here is 20%. Keep that in mind while you enjoy." As he waits, Tom seems entirely unaffected by the discomfort Ashley tries to create. He glances around the dining room, admiring the decor and the pianist's performance. When the appetizer arrives, Ashley sets the plate down forcefully, causing it to slide slightly across the table. "Here's your appetizer. I hope you enjoy it, or at least know what you're eating," she says with a mocking smile. Tom thanks her politely. "Thank you." Ashley leans in slightly, as if trying to provoke a reaction. "You know, a lot of customers who order this dish end up not liking it. It's not exactly mainstream, but I think you'll do just fine. Good luck." Tom looks at her with the same calm expression as always. "It looks excellent. Thank you for your attention." Frustrated that she can't elicit any negative reaction from him, Ashley walks away quickly, muttering something to a coworker. "That guy won't even make it to the main course. He's going to ask for the check as soon as he sees the bill." Meanwhile, Tom continues to eat his appetizer leisurely. Across the dining room, Ashley watches from a distance, her arms crossed. A malicious smile spreads across her face as she notices that he seems distracted. "I bet he's going to ask for tap water. These types always do," she comments to another staff member who visibly ignores her, uncomfortable. However, the elderly customer in nearby table continues to observe. He raises his wine glass and silently toasts in Tom's direction, who responds with a slight nod and a smile. Dinner is only just beginning, but Ashley's growing disdain won't go unnoticed for much longer. After taking Tom's order, Ashley decided to teach a lesson to the customer she believed had no right to be there. Instead of promptly taking the order to the kitchen, she made a point of prioritizing the patron she deemed more important. She stopped to chat with an elegant couple in the center of the dining room, laughed exaggeratedly at a joke told by another guest, and even delivered a cocktail to a table that wasn't hers. Meanwhile, time passed, and Tom continued to wait patiently. In an attempt to provoke him further, Ashley repeatedly walked past his table, pretending to be busy. Every time he glanced in her direction, she averted her eyes and quickened her steps, as if she were too occupied to attend to him. After a long wait, Tom was approached by one of the patrons who had been observing Ashley's behavior. The elderly man, with neatly combed white hair and dressed in a navy blue suit, approached with a kind smile. "Good evening, young man. I hope you don't mind me interrupting, but I've noticed that you've been overlooked," he said, his tone polite yet firm. Tom smiled back calmly. "Good evening. Don't worry, it's all fine." The elderly man chuckled softly and leaned in to speak more quietly. Sometimes being treated like this is a test of our patience. But I can say with certainty that maintaining your composure is a great sign of strength." Before Tom could reply, Ashley suddenly appeared, interrupting the conversation. "Sir, can I help you with something?" she asked the elderly man, her voice more polished than usual, but with a subtly authoritative tone. "I wouldn't want you to disturb our customer." The elderly man narrowed his eyes at her, but maintained his composure. "Don't worry, miss. I was just greeting this gentleman here. It's rare to find someone so serene." Ashley let out an exaggerated sigh and gestured toward the man's table. "Well, perhaps you should return to your table and enjoy your dinner," she said, clearly impatient. Tom simply observed the interaction, his expression calm yet analytical. "Thank you for coming over," he said to the elderly man with a slight nod. "It was a pleasure speaking with you." The man nodded and returned to his table, but not before casting one last look of disapproval at Ashley, who appeared entirely indifferent. When Ashley finally decided to bring Tom's main course, she made sure to take longer than necessary. First, she stopped in the kitchen to chat with the chefs, leaving the dish sitting under the warming lamp. Then she returned to the dining room to attend another table, completely ignoring the ready plate. When she finally brought the dish out, she placed it on Tom's table with a brusque gesture. "Here's your order. I hope you enjoy it," she said, her tone dripping with irony. "Oh, and if you don't like it, please let us know. We can always adjust to something more affordable." Tom thanked her with the same calm demeanor as before. "It looks excellent." "Thank you." Ashley gave a cynical smile and leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough for him to hear clearly. "Are you sure? It's a very sophisticated dish. It might be difficult for someone who's not used to it." "I'm sure," Tom replied serenely. "Thank you for your concern." Frustrated that she couldn't elicit any negative reaction from him, Ashley walked away quickly. At the bar, Ashley commented to a coworker who was unsuccessfully trying to ignore her remarks. "He's pretending to be polite, but it's obvious he's uncomfortable," she said with a laugh, placing an empty glass on the counter. "I bet he doesn't even know what he's eating." It's always the same with these types. They come here to feel important but end up making fools of themselves. Her coworker forced a smile, visibly uncomfortable. "Maybe he just wants to have dinner, Ashley. Maybe we should treat him like any other customer." She stared at him, incredulous. "Like any other customer? Did you see the boots he's wearing? He doesn't belong here, and frankly, if he can't handle it, he shouldn't even have walked through the door." Meanwhile, the couple who had been observing the scene earlier whispered to each other. "She's awful," the woman said, shaking her head. "He's being so polite, but she keeps trying to humiliate him." "I agree," the man frowned. "It's disgraceful. I think we should say something to the manager." Back at his table, Tom calmly finished his main course. He glanced around, noticing the sympathetic looks of other patrons, but he didn't appear the least bit bothered. When Ashley returned to clear the plate, her expression was still filled with disdain. "So, how was the dish? Did it meet your expectations?" she asked with a fake smile. Tom looked her straight in the eyes and replied, "It was excellent. Thank you. Please tell the chefs they did an impeccable job." She raised her eyebrows, surprised that she couldn't provoke any complaints or irritation. As she walked away, she muttered to herself, but loudly enough to be heard, "He might be smiling now, but let's see if he still is when the bill comes." Seated at the table, Tom calmly observed, a slight smile on his face. His gaze suggested that the moment to act was drawing ever closer. Ashley, increasingly frustrated by her inability to provoke Tom, decided to escalate her provocations. After serving him the coffee he had requested, she deliberately spoke loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear. It's hard to maintain standards when just anyone thinks they can walk in," she said to a colleague, casting a pointed glance in Tom's direction. The colleague, visibly uncomfortable, tried to change the subject, but Ashley continued, "That's why we have a reservations policy. It helps us avoid situations like this." Several patrons nearby began paying attention, some frowning, others whispering among themselves. The couple who had been following the situation looked outraged. The woman placed her hand on her chest, murmuring, "This is outrageous. She's trying to humiliate the man in public." The elderly man at another table took a sip of his wine, observing the scene with a look of disapproval. He muttered under his breath, "This has gone too far." Tom, still seated calmly at his table, surveyed the room without a hint of irritation. His serene demeanor seemed to unsettle Ashley even more as she now felt the eyes of other patrons on her. A well-dressed woman seated 2 tables ahead commented to her companion, "He must be someone important to stay this calm. Anyone else would have left by now." "Or maybe he's just stronger than she realizes," the man replied, casting a curious glance at Tom. Determined to provoke a reaction, Ashley returned to Tom's table to ask if he needed anything else. Her approach was anything but professional. "I hope you're enjoying your experience," she said with an exaggeratedly sarcastic smile. "After all, it's always interesting to have different kinds of people here. It adds a unique touch to the atmosphere." Tom, fixing her with a steady gaze, finally responded, his voice calm but carrying weight. "Different? Could you explain what you mean by that?" Ashley let out a short, nervous laugh, trying to maintain her composure. "Oh, don't take it the wrong way. It's just that, well, our clientele typically has a more traditional profile. It's rare to see someone with your style here." The room fell silent. Nearby diners stopped their conversations, clearly tuning into what was happening. Ashley seemed pleased with the attention she was receiving, believing she had the situation under control. Tom stayed silent for a few moments, holding her gaze. His expression was firm but devoid of anger. Finally, he spoke. "You're right. Perhaps I should handle this differently." Ashley blinked, confused, but before she could respond, the restaurant manager appeared. The manager, a middle-aged man with impeccable posture and an air of authority, scanned the room and immediately sensed the tense atmosphere. When his eyes landed on Tom, his expression changed drastically. He hurried over to the table, completely ignoring Ashley. "Mr. Cruz," the manager exclaimed, his tone filled with respect. "I wasn't aware you were visiting us today. Please let me know how I can assist you." Ashley's face turned pale, the blood draining as she watched the scene unfold. She glanced at the manager, then at Tom, utterly bewildered. Tom held the manager's gaze for a moment before turning his attention back to Ashley. "Now," he said, his tone calm but commanding, "let's talk about how we treat people." The silence in the room was deafening. All eyes were fixed on Tom's table, waiting to see what would happen next. The manager of Lumiere, a man with an impeccable appearance and a commanding demeanor, was visibly shaken as he took in the situation. Ignoring Ashley entirely, he addressed Tom directly, leaning slightly in a gesture of respect. "Mr. Cruz, I deeply apologize for the delay in recognizing you. It's an honor to have you with us this evening. Please let me know how I can make your experience more enjoyable," he said, his tone filled with deference. Ashley, who until that moment believed she was in control of the situation, froze. Her mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. "Mr. Cruz? He knows him? What's going on here?" Tom looked at the manager, offering a slight smile. "Thank you, but there's no need to worry. I'm fine. I'd just like to have a brief conversation with your staff, if that's not a problem." The manager's expression immediately grew concerned, sensing that something was amiss. "Of course, Mr. Cruz. Whatever you need." He cast a sharp, reproachful glance at Ashley, who stood beside them, pale and visibly uncomfortable. Ashley began stammering, desperately trying to regain some semblance of control. "I didn't know. I thought." The manager cut her off with firm resolve. "Thought what, Ashley? That this customer, who happens to be one of the owners of this restaurant, didn't deserve the same respect as anyone else?" His voice was low but carried a severity that drained the remaining color from her face. Ashley struggled to justify herself. He didn't say who he was, and he looked. She trailed off, realizing that anything she said would only worsen her situation. Tom finally broke the silence, his voice calm but carrying a weight that resonated across the room. "There's no need to state who I am to be treated with dignity. Frankly, it shouldn't matter. Everyone who walks through these doors, regardless of their appearance, should be welcomed with respect." The entire dining room was riveted. Many patrons murmured among themselves, stunned by the revelation that Tom was one of the restaurant's owners. The couple who had been following the interaction appeared pleased, and the elderly man nodded discreetly in approval. Nearby tables buzzed with hushed conversation. A man seated with his wife whispered, I knew there was something different about him. He has a presence that's impossible to ignore. The woman nodded. And look at how he's handling it, such grace. I hope she learned something from this. Other diners whispered among themselves, some clearly ashamed for not intervening earlier. The atmosphere in the dining room was tense, but there was a palpable sense of anticipation. Everyone wanted to see how this would end. The manager turned to Ashley again, his expression a mix of frustration and restraint. Ashley, I expect a detailed explanation of your behavior after your shift. For now, please leave this table and stay away from it. I'll take over from here. Ashley opened her mouth to protest, but the manager's resolute gaze silenced her. With an abrupt motion, she turned and hurried away, avoiding the stares of the patrons. Tom took a deep breath and stood up. He glanced around the room, noticing that all eyes were fixed on him. With a calm tone imbued with authority, he began to speak. This restaurant was founded with the idea of being a place where everyone could feel welcome, no matter how they dress or where they come from. Unfortunately, that was not the case today. But I believe we can learn from this. The diners remained silent, absorbing his words. The manager appeared both uneasy and admiring of the way Tom was handling the situation. Tom turned to the manager and concluded, I'd like to meet with the entire team after the dining room closes. There are some important things we need to discuss. The manager nodded immediately. It will be done, Mr. Cruz. Once again, I apologize for everything. Tom returned to his seat, and the dining room slowly began to return to normal, though the patrons continued to whisper about what they had just witnessed. The empty Lumiere dining room was silent. The staff stood gathered as Tom Cruise remained at the center, his presence commanding the space. He looked around, his eyes meeting each person's, conveying a profound calm but also unwavering resolve. We all make mistakes, he began, his voice steady and resonant. But what truly matters is what we do after those mistakes. Today, we witnessed a problem that goes far beyond poor service. We saw the impact of snap judgments, hidden biases, and a lack of empathy. But I want you to understand, this is not a condemnation. It's an opportunity. Tom paused, letting his words settle. His gaze lingered on Ashley, who sat at the back, her eyes filled with tears and shame. Ashley, he said, his tone gentle but firm, I know what happened today was a mistake. And mistakes can be corrected as long as there's effort and a willingness to learn. What you choose to do next will define who you are. Tom turned to the rest of the team, his voice softening but retaining its purpose. In the world we live in, it's all too easy to judge people based on what we see on the surface, their clothes, their appearance, what they drive, or where they live. But I want you to consider something. What happens when you choose to treat someone with kindness? When you decide to look beyond appearances and recognize another person's humanity? He stepped forward, placing his hands in his pockets, his tone becoming more reflective. We all carry struggles that no one else can see. The person who seems out of place might be having the worst day of their life. The one who doesn't dress as expected might have achieved more than you could imagine. The kindness we choose to extend, especially to those who seem undeserving, might just be the gesture that changes everything. The staff remained silent, absorbing his words. Some appeared visibly moved, while others stared at the floor, clearly reflecting on their own actions. Ashley finally lifted her head, wiping away her tears. Her voice was quiet but laden with remorse. I never thought about it that way before, she admitted. I was so focused on the restaurant's image, on maintaining standards, that I forgot what really matters. I forgot that every person has value, no matter who they are or what they look like. I promise, Mr. Cruz, I'll change. Tom nodded, offering her a small, encouraging smile. That promise is to yourself, Ashley, not to me. True change comes from within. And if you need help along the way, I'll be here. She nodded vigorously, a mix of relief and determination washing over her. Kindness isn't about grand gestures. It's about the small choices we make every day. It's about treating everyone we encounter as if they matter, because they do. And that is what defines the character of a place and of a person. Oh, Mr. Cruz, your message was clear. We'll work to ensure that Lumiere reflects exactly what you envisioned. Thank you for reminding us of that. Tom simply nodded, offering a serene smile as he stepped out of the restaurant. The streets of Beverly Hills sparkled under the city lights. He paused briefly on the sidewalk, gazing at Lumiere's entrance. His soft smile returned as he reflected. What had transpired that evening wasn't just about a restaurant or a mistreated cause. It was about the importance of creating spaces where people feel seen, heard, and valued. And Tom knew that even in the most challenging situations, there was an opportunity to inspire and transform. As he walked down the illuminated streets, Tom thought about what he had said, but also about the message he hoped others would take from that night. If he could leave everyone who heard the story with one thought, it would be this: in a world where you can be anything, choose to be kind. True strength lies not in judgment, but in acceptance. And above all, remember, it's in the small choices we make every day that we shape not only the world around us, but also who we are as human beings. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen